So, history of Japan. We don't really know when the first human beings occupied the islands of Japan, but we do, especially since the Second World War, they found quite a number of early Stone Age settlements where they have found evidence, pottery, and various other stone chipping tools and that sort of thing. So we do know that there were prehistoric settlements in Japan. Apparently there were at one point, we believe, land bridges across the Tsushima Straits, which is between Korea and the islands of Japan, and then across the Tsugawa Strait here up to the north, and then the Soya Strait, which connects the Sakhalin area, which is now part of Russia, with Japan. So we believe that people came to the islands because either they had land bridges or that the land bridges were complete enough that there was a very short passage in water so that they could come by boat. So very early on, we have the people joining the islands through land bridges and through communities there. Now, as you probably know by now, there are 4 primary islands in Japan. The main island, the largest one, is Honshu here. In the north, you have Hokkaido. The smallest island, Shikoku, is just south of the south end of Honshu, and then you have Kyushu Island down here. We're going to be visiting 3 of those in this cruise, as well as South Korea. So you'll have an experience of some of the different climates and the different areas of Japan. The earliest named period we have for the history of Japan is called the Jomon period. It literally means cords. They're known for the cord-marked pottery that they have, these various sort of lines. It's not thrown pottery, it's not using a wheel, they're hand-built. But then you have a very distinctive series like that. If you go to museums, then you'll sometimes see pieces of pottery and they're very distinctive. You'll know what period they're from. They're from the Jomon period. The second period that we have, and that's 10,500 to 3000 BC. And then the next period we have is the Yayoi period, and the Yayoi period took considerable advances. It's from about 300 BC to 250 AD. Our screen is not quite low enough here. They had thrown pottery and higher temperature firing of the ceramics so that it was more durable. They also had metallurgy, so that we have examples, beautiful examples of metal bells coming out of this early period, which again began around 300 BC. That's where they began rice cultivation. Much of this was adopted and adapted from China to Korea to Japan, of course, like so many other things. But that's where we also get textile production, and we get formal burial rites. The way in which people deal with their dead is often one of the most important signs of civilization. If they bury their dead with artifacts that are to be used in the afterlife, then that indicates that they as a society have developed a much more in-depth theology for what life and the afterlife are. Their religion is more advanced, in other words. And so we find evidence of that as far back as the Yayoi period. The earliest reference we have to Japan as a nation is in Chinese chronicles, where they refer to it around 50 AD as the Wei, and so, or Wo, the 2 different references. So Wo in the Chinese chronicles in the 1st century were references to the fact that there were people in Japan and the people of China were aware of them and had some relationship with them. And by the way, I very intentionally will use BC and AD to refer to the period before the time of Christ and after the time of Christ. Typically in the academic circles, we will more often use BCE, which means before the Common Era, and CE for the Common Era. I hope it's not offensive that I use BC and AD, but the reason I do that is because when I use BCE and CE, people just get confused because you're used to seeing BC and AD. So that's why I use those, all right? And again, I hope it's not offensive to anybody that I still use those terms. The earliest imperial period, and in fact, in other words, the first time that we have a king, somebody who is taking over larger sections of Japan, is the Yamato period. It's the earliest sort of imperial period. Began in the 4th century and lasted up until the 9th century. Right in the middle of that, a major event is when Buddhism in the 6th century came to Japan. But the Yamato early imperial period was 4th to 9th century. It's also called the tumulus period. I don't know if you all have, how many of you all have ever been to Osaka? Okay, well you're going to get to go there, so that's great. This is downtown Osaka, and in the middle of Osaka you have these keyhole-shaped tombs. They are called tumulus, and this was from this early period, the early Yamato period. The center of their kingdom was in the Osaka area. Now, to give you some idea, this tomb, which is, well, it's 1,380 feet long. It's estimated that it took 1,000 laborers working every day 4 years to build this tomb. Again, when you get that kind of investment in afterlife memorials like tombs, then that is an indication of a higher level of civilization. It was in this point that the ruler of the Yamato period began to be known as the Tenyo, or the Emperor of Heaven. They began to have a sense in which there was a divine right to the person who was ruling, and underneath that ruler, the emperor, they would have a very complex series of court levels. They had 12 distinct levels, and in one period of time, each of them had to wear a different color to identify where they were in the hierarchy of their society. After Buddhism came, and the usual date for that is 552 AD, the 6th century, people early on were very fascinated in Japan with Buddhism. Of course, Shinto, the folk religion, had been around for time immemorial. As long as people could remember, some version of that folk religion had existed. It became more sophisticated later. But a young prince in the late 6th century named Prince Shotoku was enamored of Buddhism. He completely committed himself to it. He built Buddhist temples and pagodas and various other kinds of buildings in all over Japan, and at least the area they controlled. And he was so serious about it that he gave lectures about it. He wrote commentaries on Buddhist theology. He was a huge advocate, and one of the reasons why Buddhism became as popular as it was, that is in the late 6th century. And around the middle of the 7th century, they had what were called, very important, the Tyka Reforms, in which the ruling emperor, solidified his power according to law, but they also instituted a system which, again, they had adapted from China, which was called the Ritsuryu system. Ritsuryu, the Ritsu means government structure, so that there was a clear delineation of bureaucracy within the Chinese system. And then the Ryo means the administrative or civil codes. So they structured their government based upon what they'd learned from China, and they also set up civil codes. Some of what happened with that is they set up schools to teach young nobles, and at first it was nobles, later on they opened it up to everybody, and then eventually went back to being nobles again. Anyone could study in order to take tests, again this was from China, they got this, to become part of this bureaucracy, to be part of the Ritsuryu system, so that they would be regional administrators or part of the government system. It's similar to taking a civil service exam in the US, all right, where you study for it, you take the exam, and in Japan, as in China, they would test people regularly and see if they had maintained their qualifications, and their job would be adjusted based upon that. Well, one of the other parts of the Ritsuryu system is that the emperor, it was declared that the state owned all the land. There was no such thing as private ownership, which meant the emperor owned it all. And then every year, the emperor and the state would parcel out the land to individuals in order to grow crops on it, particularly rice, which had become the dominant crop by that time, coming over from Korea. So they would allot the land. They would do it every 6 years. Later on, that got to be too big a problem, as the amount of land they controlled grew as they moved further north into areas that previously had been controlled by more primitive groups, the Imo and the Ainu. But as they parceled out the land every year, they would actually assign it to boys, males, at age 6 years. And they would give them a parcel of land, and that young boy, as he grew up, and of course the family would be involved in it early on, but he was allowed to grow rice on that property for the rest of his life. at which point it would be reverted back to the emperor. It was not hereditary, and then it would be reassigned to somebody else. In return for that, everyone had to pay a tax for the rice that they grew. A certain amount of rice had to be sent to the emperor, to the capital, every year. That wasn't so much, but then they also required a head tax paid in rice, so that the number of people who were involved in the farming, you had to pay a tax for that, and it was the responsibility of the individual to get the rice, or if there were some other crops they did as well, millet and whatnot, but to get the crop to the capital city. And in this case, Osaka. So imagine if you had to make a trip to Washington, D.C. every year in order to pay your taxes, right? So that's sort of what they had to do, and it's pretty onerous. It was very difficult for them. And they also regularly, the common people had to give time in order to work on administrative projects. You know, if they're putting in dams or canals or building a castle for the local clan lord, they had to spend time on that. And early on, they had a conscription army where everyone had to participate in that. That changed later, which is the part of the coming of the samurai. So this is the very earliest time, and they're in Osaka. As I mentioned, the emperor, and first the prince, and he became emperor later, he was very involved in promoting Buddhism. Well, that came back to bite him, because the Buddhists in the area around Osaka became so plentiful, the Buddhist priests and monks, that they ended up trying to run the government. They ended up trying to tell the emperor what to do. So the emperor did the only sensible thing. He left Osaka and moved to the city of Nara. This is, from this point on, they would name the various first emperors and then the shoguns later, that I'll explain about that transition, according to the city that they were in. Now, it's not always the city name we know, but the city of Nara was the first, actually the first city in Japan, and also the first imperial capital when they moved to Nara in 710. And they were there from 710 until 794. This is more formally the start of the imperial state, because they had a stable capital where they would remain. Prior to this time, whenever a ruler died, you know, they were all part of one family, but when a ruler would die, they would move the capital to a new town, because they considered it bad luck to stay in the town that had been selected by the ruler that was now dead. So they find a new place to live. Nara was the first permanent capital, and they were there from 710 to 794. At this point, the Ritsuryo system of growing crops and paying taxes to the capital was going quite well, and they began to allow commoners to attend the school and take the tests to become part of the bureaucracy, part of the government system. And so it was possible by merit to move up in society. So even though they had strict hierarchies for the nobles, the common people could actually do better in their lives. They continued to build temples and pagodas and monasteries in various areas. Buddhism was very important at this point. Later on, after the Meiji Emperor in the mid-19th century, they actually tried to suppress Buddhism, which is, you still see it a lot here, but it's not as powerful as it was at one point. But during this period of time, for instance, they created the Daibutsu, it's called, or the Great Buddha. This is in Nara, the capital city of that time. It is an extraordinary structure. If you have a chance to go to Nara, I would recommend that you visit that as well. All of these monasteries that the emperor sponsored around the country with monks and nuns, Buddhist monks and nuns, they had one job as far as he was concerned, and that was they were to pray for the state and for the emperor. And they were to do that. That was their purpose. They also raised food for themselves and whatnot, but they were there to pray for the government. So even here, though, they ended up getting problems from some of the Buddhist monks. Again, it grew so powerful, they were trying to control the government, and this became a difficulty. The emperor at that time, Emperor Shomu, ended up marrying the daughter, and this is during the Nara period, ended up marrying the daughter of the Fujiwara clan leader. This is critical. This, for several hundred years after this became a model where the young emperors, when they first took over as emperor, they were supposed to marry at that point, one clan, the Fujiwara clan, would provide one of their daughters to marry the emperor, which of course meant the next emperor was a grandson of the head of the Fujiwara clan. And in fairly short order, it ended up being that the Fujiwara clan was by far the most powerful family in Japan, and in many cases they actually ran the country as regents behind the throne, because the emperor was a relative, and the emperor, especially when they were younger, were being controlled. And that Fujiwara family ended up being the cause of some very serious conflicts and changes in Japan later on, so I mention it here. In 794, the emperor moved the capital again, mostly because of the difficulty that they were having with Buddhists, trying to tell them what to do in Nara now. And they moved it to the city of Kyoto, which is still considered probably the most important ancient capital of Japan. Kyoto, it's called the Heian period because that was the name of the town of Kyoto back then. So for the next almost 500 years, or 400 years, sorry, they were ruling from Kyoto. And that's why you have so many Buddhist temples, so many shrines, why it's such a beautiful city in Kyoto. And in fact, Kyoto became understood as so much the location of the emperor and the imperial court that in the 1200s, so 12th century, when the emperor moved to Edo, which is modern Tokyo, still today, as a joke, I mean, they know this isn't the case, but still today, the citizens of Kyoto will say, the emperor's trip is taking so very long. When is he coming home? You know, when is he coming back to Kyoto? Because he officially did not announce that he was moving the capital when he left Kyoto and moved to Edo. But it was during this period of time, up till this period of time, the central government and the hierarchy established by the central government in Nara and then early in Kyoto, they had been responsible very closely with running the government throughout the whole of then Japan. They would appoint the governors, and the governors would respond back. But at this period of time, even though the Heian period was a huge period in terms of culture, this is when so much of the distinctive Japanese aesthetic and culture were really developing. You remember I told you that in the 6th century we had Buddhism come in, and for the 7th and 8th centuries it was really a reflection of Chinese and Korean Buddhism that was affecting it. And then when you get into the 9th century, which is right after this period started, you get much more of a distinctive Japanese approach to arts and culture, and the Japanese ethos begins to be much more evident in their culture. So, and that's during the Heian period, so it was very important culturally. At this point, the government, because they were having such a great time with all the arts and culture and everything, I guess, they stopped paying as much attention to what was happening out in the countryside. And they started delegating more of the responsibility for managing the country out away from the capital to the various families, the clan lords. The clan lords were called daimyos, and you'll hear that word a lot. Some of you were with me when we were in the Buddhist temple on top of the mountain, and they had a board there with all of these look like brass plaques, all of them with different logos. I recognized those, and the monk there confirmed this, that those were the symbols, the logos for the various daimyos, the clan lords. Each of them had a medallion that would be on their flag, and that was their symbol, it was their logo. So the daimyos started taking more responsibility for running the government at this point, fairly early in the Heian period. And each of the daimyos had their own small army. In some cases it wasn't so small, and they were called the samurai. We'll talk about that in more detail this afternoon, but more and more the daimyos and their samurai, who were their strong men when it came to tax collecting, they would be responsible for collecting the taxes. And then obviously they would take a cut, and then they would send what was required off to the capital city. Well, prior to this time too, the rule had been that everyone had to pay taxes except places of Buddhist temples, or shrines, or any holy place, any place that had a religious monument on it. They didn't have to pay taxes. Well, the daimyos were clever. They started building temples and shrines on their property, which meant that any produce that was grown on that property, they didn't have to pay taxes on it. The other thing that they did, there was a rule, because there was a lot of land still that was uncultivated. And there was no plan for how to take care of that. And so the government said anyone who would take over land and cultivate it and pay the taxes on it, I'm sorry, not pay the taxes on it, but continue to cultivate it, they would not have to pay taxes, and they would eventually have ownership of the land after a certain period of time. So the daimyos are taking up all of this area that had been uncultivated. They're cultivating it. They don't have to pay taxes on that, so they get all of the benefit. And eventually they ended up growing their domain of control, the area that the daimyo or the family clan could own. Eventually this became a real problem because the more this happened, the less money and therefore the less power and authority the emperor had. And so more and more of it was being pushed out to the daimyos and to their samurai armies. It was also during this period of time that the first of the child emperors came along. The plan that they had for running the government under Ritsuhiro did not plan for there ever being a non-adult emperor. And so when they started having emperors die younger, and it's interesting, one of the reasons, one of our guides told us, that the emperors were so honored that they only gave them what they thought was the very best food. For instance, before they gave them rice, they would polish it. They were the very refined rice. And of course, that meant it had almost no nutrition in it. And they were given the finest of foods, which were not very nutritious. And so the emperors started dying younger and younger because they simply were not healthy. They were not being fed well, even though they were being given what they thought was a luxurious diet, the very finest. So you end up with emperors dying in their 40s and having fairly young new emperors. And so at that point, the Fujiwara grandfathers started taking more and more control. And there was less and less control or authority in the emperors. And you began to see this shift of power away from the emperor and away from the capital city. Those daimyos, those clan lords, lived in buildings like this, and you will see some of those as we go along if you haven't seen them before in China. This is called a castle in Japan, and it is not like the architecture I talked about yesterday. You will notice that these stone walls, and these stone walls will go up 30 feet or so in most cases. Usually they're set on a hill, and there is a convoluted kind of staircase going up that they could defend in multiple places. They were intended to be a defensive point in the case of war. They were prepared as military installations, but the clan lords, the daimyos, would live here. And more, they're building these kinds of castles and building up their armies during the Heian period, during Kyoto. Eventually, I mentioned the Fujiwara grandfathers were really controlling behind the throne. Well, they then developed a system which lasted for several hundred years, where at a certain point, this started in 1068, where at a certain point as adults, the emperors would enter monasteries, and they would become Buddhist monks. And they were called cloistered emperors because they still maintained control, particularly if their sons were young or not particularly strong. There would be an emperor, but the emperor's father, who was technically a Buddhist monk, would be the one who's still running things. These were called the cloistered monks. And so the warriors out, the clan lords, the daimyos, and the samurai are looking at all this stuff going on in the capital, and they're having less and less respect, less and less regard for the authority of the emperor and the imperial court because they saw it as being very political and simply not strong. They were not being straightforward. So what happened is in the 1100s, any of you have been in the military, when you're in the military and there's not any, there's no military action or any place to guard or whatever, what do they do? They say, okay, I want you to paint all the rocks around this parking lot. And when you're done, I want you to paint them all again. Okay, I'm not happy with that. Do it again. Well, the point is that when you have a military force and they don't have anybody to fight, you have to keep them busy because they're trained to fight people. And so that can create difficulties. Well, the same thing happened with the samurai. When they were not having enemies, Korea, there were efforts in the 1500s to invade Korea. There were in the 1200s twice the Mongols from the Yuan dynasty in China tried to invade Japan. But when they didn't have anybody to fight, these samurai groups would start fighting each other. And the clans would have minor conflicts, and eventually they became fairly significant wars between samurai armies and clans. Eventually, full-fledged war broke out in the late 1100s, and the samurai divided up on different sides. They were actively fighting, and eventually there was one battle in which some of the samurai were defending the boy emperor, and the other side was fighting against them because they felt they were tired of the way the empire was being run. I don't think I have that, no. And so a huge battle happened in the late 1100s in which 200,000 samurai went to war against each other. And the end result was the side that was against the emperor won. The ruler of that group was called Minamoto no Yoritomo. And when he defeated the samurai armies that were on the side of the emperor, the assumption was he would march into Kyoto and he would make himself emperor. But he didn't do that. Instead, he went home to his clan center, which was in Kamakura, which is closer to Tokyo than it is to Kyoto. And he said the emperor's fine. The emperor can stay on his throne. It's just he no longer has any power. This was the beginning of the first shogunate, the first shogun. They had previously, when they were fighting against some of the tribes, particularly in the north of Japan, that had not wanted to give in under the emperor, under the Yamato emperor, they had armies that would go to try to quell this and try to suppress them and bring them into the fold. The commander of that was called a Saii Tai Shogun, which literally means the commander-in-chief of the expeditionary force against the barbarians. Sort of like generalissimo. It means a general, but who is in charge of more than just the army. Well, Minamoto declared himself to be the shogun over all of Japan. He not only had control of all of the military at this point, but he developed systems to control all the judiciary, all the administrative functions of the government. And so from the late 1100s until the mid-late 1800s, for a period of almost 700 years, Japan was not ruled by the emperor, although the emperor was still in place. It was ruled by a shogun. You've either seen James Clavell's book or read the book Shogun, or seen the mini-series. So for this long period of time, the shogun ran the country, even though the emperor was still on his throne. This was the time of the real rise of the samurai, when they became very powerful because they represented the daimyos who were underneath the shogun, and so they were the real power in the country. In fact, the shogun set up his own government called the bakufu, which literally means the tent government, because that's what they had called it back when they were really an expeditionary force going north and fighting against the various other tribal peoples. So the bakufu became the government under the shogun, and the court was just a formality. They were just icing. They had no authority whatsoever. So those shoguns ended up ruling, as I said, from 1185 to 1868, and this was the first one. This is called the Kamakura Shogunate because that was where his headquarters were. That was his home. And as I say, just like with the various imperial families, they would name it based upon the city they were in. So from 1192 to 1199, this man, Minamoto no Yoritomo, was the shogun and ruler. The shoguns had the daimyos be the judges. This is a daimyo, samurai daimyo, sitting in judgment on a legal case, and so everything was handled and managed by the new shogun's bakufu, his government. Now during this time of the Kamakura period, the shoguns really liked Buddhism, and they especially really liked Zen Buddhism, which had been introduced fairly late, developed. It had come from China to Korea to Japan. They loved the meditation of it because it gave them a focus and a strength that they felt was very consistent with their military expectations, their martial desires. They could meditate, and to the point that they did not fear death when they went into battle as much, and they also were able to deal with the kind of bloody killing that they often were involved in. So they liked Zen Buddhism. It was during this period of time, fairly early, twice in the 1200s, when, as I said, the Mongol armies tried to invade Japan, and they were driven off not by military force, because the Mongols, this was Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, was the ruler of Yuan dynasty in China, and they tried to invade. The Mongols very seldom got stopped when they wanted to invade, but in those two periods, in the 1270s and 1280s, they had typhoons that destroyed or drove off the Mongol Navy twice. And so in Japan, they considered that miraculous, that this was a miraculous intervention by the gods, the spirits, which are called the kami. If you heard my first talk, or if you come this afternoon, you'll understand about kami. 2 o'clock, I'll redo the religions. And so they call those winds that defeated the Mongol navies the kamikazes, which the divine winds that destroyed their fleets. And the word kamikaze, of course, gets used later on to refer to the suicide attackers in the Second World War, the special attack groups as they were formerly known. This is another image of Minamoto Yoritomo releasing cranes as a way to seek blessing as a Buddhist. It was a Buddhist ceremony. This was his half-brother. And his half-brother is a great hero in the history of Japan. His name is Minamoto Yoshitsune. And yet, because he was so popular and so powerful, he ended up being, his brother forced him to commit seppuku, ritual suicide. Eventually, all things come to an end, and eventually the Minamoto Shogunate ended in 1338, and a new family took over. There was a short period before this new family took over called the Warring Period, in which the daimyo started fighting each other again. And then a man named Ashikaga Takauji took over and created a new shogunate called the Muromachi Shogunate, because that was his home. It's actually a suburb of Kyoto. It's called the Muromachi or the Ashikaga period. And this is a period, again, when this is the Golden Pavilion in Kyoto. If you haven't seen it, it's well worth seeing, and you'll have the opportunity to see it with about 200,000 other people if you go there, because it's the most popular site probably in all of Japan, certainly in Kyoto. But the development, this is a great warrior's tomb here, and they continued to develop the various arts, so it was a very powerful period. In the mid-1500s, so sort of toward the end of this Muromachi period, the various Europeans tried to get more involved in Japan. We had Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch. 1549, the Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier was successful in getting into Japan, and he actually converted a number of Japanese, particularly farmers, but also some of the daimyos, to Christianity. But later on, the decision was made by the shogun that Christianity was not consistent with their martial kind of spirit, and so it was suppressed quite ruggedly, to be honest. Then, at the late 1500s, we had the Japanese, under the Muromachi Shogunate, tried to invade Korea twice in the late 1500s. And the shogun at that period was killed on the second of those expeditions, and in fact they sneaked his body back into the capital because they were afraid that if people knew he had died, there would be a civil war. So during that period of time, by the way, in the late 1500s, when they invaded Korea, they were winning on the land. Their land armies were defeating the Koreans, but the Koreans had a general who was just spectacular, and he defeated their navy. So the Japanese Navy being defeated, they had to retreat. When they came back, this was called the Imjin War. When they came back from the Imjin War, they brought with them a great many kidnapped Korean ceramicists, as I mentioned in the last talk about art and architecture. So that Korean ceramics, Korean pottery became a dominant influence, and really some of the finest versions of Japanese ceramics today is because of the kidnapped Korean potters that were brought over in the late 1500s. But when that shogun died, a new shogunate was created called the Tokugawa Shogunate. Tokugawa Ieyasu is this fellow that you see here. In fact, many people think of him as almost being the first shogun, because this is the shogun that led right up to the modern period, and he was very, very influential. It was during this period that most of the great castles, some of them had existed before, but most of the great castles are built during this period of time under the Tokugawa Shogunate. In the 1600s, in 1600, a Dutch vessel was shipwrecked just off the coast, and the Dutch sailors and captain made it to shore. Well, I mentioned that Francis Xavier, the Catholic Jesuit missionary, had come. Well, this is a period of time, 1600, when Protestantism had affected a lot of Europe, and especially the Netherlands. The Netherlands became Protestant reform, and so the captain of the ship, speaking to the shogun, he's telling him, well, the Catholics are lying to you. The Catholics' theology is all wrong. This is not what Christianity is all about. And it created such a kerfuffle, because some of the daimyo, some of the clan lords had become Christian, that the Tokugawa shogun was completely turned off by all of this Western bickering and this Western arguing and this Western claiming that you've been lied to and all of that. He felt like this whole thing, he needed to just stop, get rid of all of it. And so in 1637, he declared that Japan was now going to be isolated from the West. And for over 200 years, from 1637 up until Commodore Perry in 1853, they went through a period called Sakoku, which means isolation in Japanese. So for 220 to 230 years, there was no Japanese commoners that were allowed to leave Japan. There were no international foreigners allowed to come into Japan. This is an image of a beacon, a fire beacon. They constructed these along the coast because if any foreign ships were identified coming into or trying to come into Japan, the beacons were to be lit, and the goal was to destroy those ships before they could land. No one was allowed into the country, and many tried. Many of them tried to come into Japan because Japan had, like China had silks, they had ceramics, they had a lot of other things, and in the West they wanted to be able to trade for. And in 1853, Matthew Perry, an American Commodore with 4 American gunships, the very latest in military technology, with the finest of guns, with exploding shells and all that. This is him in the center, and then the lower right-hand side. It appears from the drawings that either they did not like him or he was not a particularly handsome man. So he's represented here in 1853 when he comes into the harbor, the Edo harbor, which was the capital. They moved it to Tokyo under the Tokugawa Shogunate. They moved to Tokyo. He cruises into the harbor and he fires off some blanks from his gun so that they could be impressed, suitably impressed by this. This was really the beginning of what's called gunboat diplomacy. He landed there. He had a letter from the American president to the emperor because it was isolated. Nobody knew the emperor had been running the country for hundreds of years. And so they met the shogun, and he presented the request and the letter from the president. And Matthew Perry, the Commodore, American Commodore, made it very clear that we come in peace unless you are not willing to open your ports to us, in which case we will open them for you using our advanced weapons. Now remember, for almost 230 years, Japan had been completely isolated, which means they had not progressed technologically, they had not developed manufacturing, they did not have a modern army. Their army was still the samurai, and they were fighting with bows and arrows and swords. And here we've got, steel cannon and exploding shells. So Matthew Perry said, I'll give you a year to think about this and we'll come back. Well, he only gave him 6 months, but he came back the next year in 1854 and he brought 7 gunships. At this point, the shogun, who at least respected military might, agreed that they would open their borders and that they would begin to allow first the Americans, and later on they very quickly drew up contracts of trade with various other Western European powers, the French, the British, Portuguese, the Dutch. And so it really opened up Japan at that point in the 1850s and 60s. And yet, people immediately began to see a very negative influence from some of this. In 1866, we have a new emperor, the Meiji Emperor. Meiji means enlightened peace. And this is actually the family that Hirohito, who was the emperor, the current emperor, and then Hirohito, the emperor of the Second World War, was part of this family. When the Meiji Emperor comes along, and still the shogun is in charge. Well, after the shogun allowed Western powers in, because he thought that was necessary because of the military might of these countries and the fact that Japan was nowhere near close to being able to fight them, the shogun went around to the daimyos, his generals in effect, that lived in the head of the clans and lived in the country, to get their support for him having made that decision. And he discovered that to a man, the daimyos were against him having allowed the Westerners to come in. They considered them foreign devils and a bad cultural influence. And so they decided that it was time to get rid of the shogun. Two of the major families, Satsuma and Joseon, from the south of Japan, joined together and invited other daimyos to join them, and they launched a war against the shogun in favor of returning power to the emperor, because they thought that the country would be better off if the emperor was running it. This is called the Meiji Restoration, because they restored the power to the emperor that previously had been held by the shogun. And as I mentioned, you'll notice this picture is from the 1880s, very westernized clothes. This would have been what Western Europeans would have worn in the same period of time. The Meiji Emperor, when the war was over and the shogun had been beaten and displaced, the emperor was reestablished as being the real authority in the country, much to the chagrin of the daimyos. One of the things that he did within a few years is he declared no more daimyos, no more hierarchical structure, no more samurai. The Meiji Emperor wanted to create a modern, westernized country that could compete with the Western nations. And so rather than have these sort of volunteer samurai who had grown up, and if young people had martial skills, they would be made a warrior, he wanted a conscription army. And so in very short order, the laws were passed to outlaw the daisho, that is the carrying of the two swords. They could no longer carry their swords. They no longer could wear the distinctive samurai top knot. They were not allowed to be called samurai anymore. They were called shikozen, which simply means warrior family, but it had no authority at all. And the daimyos did not have authority anymore. In fact, the movie, the Tom Cruise movie, The Last Samurai, have you seen it? The Last Samurai is about the last of the samurai. Tom Cruise isn't the last samurai, and the main character, the Japanese character, isn't. Well, it's a plural. The samurai is plural, where the last samurai is about the very end of the samurai period, after Western consultants had been brought in to teach the military, Western arms had been purchased, and there was a commitment by the Meiji Emperor and others to, there's a few factual errors in that movie, like they got this young, kind of weak emperor, and that was not the Meiji Emperor that did all this. But this was a period of time in which they got rid of all of that, brought in a completely different westernized approach. And of course, the desire of the Meiji, by saying we want to modernize, westernize, we want to be able to fight against Western powers, to be equal to them, that required manufacturing. And as I said before, Japan had no coal, they had no oil, they had no iron. And so they had to begin to look around and say, where are we going to find that stuff? And that this growth of the imperialistic kind of Japan, they looked to Korea, right across the Tsushima Straits, very close to them. The closest landmass to Japan had everything they wanted. And so they ended up fighting against the Chinese for control of Japan, for control of Korea. Korea was an independent nation, but they were a tribute nation to China. China really controlled everything. So in 1894 and 95, we have the first Sino-Japanese War, in which Japan and China went to war primarily over control of Korea. The Japanese, to everyone's surprise, won that war, and so they took over control of Korea and were also given Taiwan, some other islands, and control of part of Manchuria. The Russians came in and took the Manchuria part away from them, or at least by threat. They got France and Germany to get on their side and say, tell the Japanese they can't have Manchuria, which is the part of China that's in the northeastern corner. And so the Japanese backed off, but then in 1904 and 5, when the Russians refused to even negotiate with them about things, they did a surprise attack against Port Arthur, a Russian port, destroyed a bunch of their ships, ended up, before it was all over, in the Russo-Japanese War, destroying 2 of Russia's 3 navies. They had a Pacific Navy, a Baltic Navy, and a Black Sea Navy fleet, and they destroyed 2 of those 3 fleets of Russia. And then Teddy Roosevelt, the American president, came in and negotiated peace between the 2. But Japan had proven, by beating first the Chinese and then the Russians, that they really were a world power. In 1931, after having won all of that, they actually invade the northeastern province of China called Manchuria, and they turned it into a puppet state called Manchukuo. In 1933, the League of Nations says, you've stolen part of China's land, you need to get out of there, and they refuse and leave the League of Nations. In 1937, they pretty much create a pretense to launch the second Sino-Japanese War, and they invade the rest of China during that, and that's really the start of the military actions of the Second World War, 1937. It's in war theory, it's called the Burma, India, China theater of war. But the Japanese not only controlled all of Manchuria, but as they invaded, they controlled much further down. This includes areas that Shanghai and Peking, what later became Beijing. They controlled every port, the purple part down here. They ended up taking over the Philippines, of course. Eventually Burma, Thailand, French Indochina, British Malaya, and all of the East Indies were controlled by Japan. And in early 1941, this militarism, this imperial growth desire by Japan led to them naming Hideaki Tojo, who was a general in the imperial army, as the prime minister. And that eventually led, of course, on December 7th of 1941, Japan attacks the only enemy they thought had the power to challenge them in the Pacific region, which was the American Navy. December 7th, 1941, they attacked Pearl Harbor to try to destroy the American Navy before they could do anything about it. Unfortunately, they missed the aircraft carriers, who were out of Pearl Harbor on maneuvers at that point. Within 7 hours of attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese also attacked Hong Kong, Singapore, Wake Island, the Philippines, and Burma, the primary U.S. and British possessions or areas of control within this Asia area. From December 41 to April of 42, the Japanese continue to consolidate and continue to spread further and further out into the Pacific. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, they were trying to isolate Australia, to cut it off from the Western powers. They were defeated. Well, not really defeated. Actually, they sank more ships, but they were pushed back. That was the first time that the Japanese were stopped in their efforts. And then Midway Island, which was just 6 months, June 1942, after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese, because their coded messages, the code had been broken by Americans. We knew what they were doing, and they thought they were going to trap and ambush the U.S. Navy, the remaining part of the U.S. Navy, especially aircraft carriers, but instead they ended up being ambushed themselves. And 4 of the major capital aircraft carriers and cruisers and destroyers as well were destroyed at Midway. And that really was the turning point of the war, because it was such a devastating blow. So the Allies, both from Pearl Harbor across the center of the Pacific under Chester Nimitz, the admiral, and then from Australia under Douglas MacArthur with Australian troops, came up to retake the Philippines, and eventually Okinawa in April to June 1945 was the last major battle of the Pacific War, and every battle was more horrific than the last, because the closer the Allies got to the Japanese home islands, the more aggressive the Japanese were in trying to stop them. So that the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War was Okinawa, the last major battle. Of course, despite the fact that the Allies had firebombed 67 of the major Japanese cities and had virtually destroyed many of them. In fact, in one night, Operation Meeting House, the bombing of Tokyo on March 9th and 10th of 1941, they destroyed, there were 260,000 people left homeless, 100,000 people killed. There were more people killed in the firebombing of Tokyo in that one night than died at the moment of bombing in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. But on August 6th of 1945, they dropped the first atomic weapon on Hiroshima. August 8th, the Soviet Union joins the other allies in declaring war against Japan and invades Manchuria. August 9th, Nagasaki is bombed with a nuclear weapon. And so on the 14th, 5 days later, the emperor declares that he will accept the terms of surrender, which was quite unusual. The emperor did not get involved in political matters. He was considered a deity. And so he was not to soil himself with being involved in that, but eventually he stepped up and said, this has got to stop. And then on the 2nd of September, the formal surrender aboard the Missouri battleship. And then the Allies from 1945 to 1952 controlled Japan with the U.S. occupation. the primary leader of that was Douglas MacArthur, who was the senior commander of the Allied Powers, or SCAP here. He was actually still the supreme commander of Allied Powers over Japan when he then got involved in leadership in the Korean War. This image, there's a history behind this. This image was taken, this photograph was taken the first time that they met, when Douglas MacArthur and the Emperor met, after MacArthur got to Tokyo. And the Japanese newspapers outlawed the printing of this because it showed their emperor, who was perceived as being divine, not divine like the god, but a god, a great spirit, a great kami. And we'll talk about that again. If you missed it, we'll talk about it this afternoon. And standing next to this much larger, much taller, heavier MacArthur, and he was called the Gaijin Shogun, meaning the white shogun or the Western shogun, because he was the military ruler. And so the U.S. controlled Japan from 1945 to 1952 in the occupation. And very short order after that, the Japanese obviously had a miraculous recovery economically and became a major world power, not militarily, but economically. The only last thing I would mention, because you've heard of it, on March 11th of 2011, there was a 9.0 earthquake that struck undersea near the northern part of Honshu Island, the main island. And it ended up, it's the Fukushima prefecture, it ended up not only killing 20,000 people and leaving tens of thousands homeless, it also led to a major nuclear accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. Not because of any fault of the Japanese, but because of this natural disaster. But Japan, of course, has become a major world player in terms of economy. I've gone longer than usual, so any questions about any of that? Sometimes people laugh when I ask that, when I'm given a whole history of a nation. Any questions?
Yes.
Yes?
Why didn't Yamamoto kill the emperor?
What's that?
Why didn't he, was it Yamamoto, why didn't he kill the emperor? Why didn't he do away with it?
Well, Yamamoto would not have, oh, you mean the shogun?
Yeah, when he won that battle against the emperor, why didn't he kill him?
Miyamoto, yes. You said Yamamoto. Yamamoto was the leader of the military in the Second World War and was killed in a plane crash. He was shot down. But why didn't Miyamoto kill the emperor? Well, because he was perceived as divine, and politically he was very smart. You know, he said, leave the emperor on his throne, let people continue to pretend that this is, he's in charge. Don't shake the boat so much that people get upset about it, but he just began to take over, because he controlled the military. And so I think it was for political reasons. He saw that he would create greater instability by killing the emperor, and people thought that's what he was going to do. They assumed he would march into Kyoto and take over the throne and make himself emperor, but he didn't do that because he felt like that would cause even some of his own followers, because the emperor was seen as divine and a very different kind of person. Even some of his own followers probably have rebelled about that. Any other questions? You now have, oh yes, in the back, have to speak up.
Our guide yesterday talked about the first emperor, and that first emperor was rejected by everyone, and how he draw legitimacy without the consensus.
So how did the first emperor, and this would have been under the Yamato, the first imperial period, how did they gain the authority necessary in order to become emperor? Well, it's like any other leader. People will begin to recognize leadership capabilities. Later on, once the position was established and was seen as divine, the emperor sometimes, from time to time, would be very weak. Well, the first emperors would have to have been very strong. They would have to have been acknowledged as a leader. And then as a leader of a small group, then they would take over control of another group. And then eventually, success breeds success. And you begin to get more authority by the aspect of your success. So the early emperors would have had to have been very strong characters. It's the same story of rulers who take power in anywhere, among the Vikings, in Europe, in wherever else. It starts out small, perhaps, but then people of strong personality, you get the Charlemagnes and the William the Conquerors and these people, that initially it's almost by force of personality that they're able to get people to follow them, and as more people follow them, they're able to, even by force of conquest, take over more and more area. So, yes?
Why didn't the British do what Perry did earlier?
Why didn't the British do what Perry did earlier? It's a good question. I mean, all of these other countries were very interested in doing this. I think that Perry and the Americans were, at this period of time, you know, they had just, they were feeling their oats. They were feeling like we can make these things happen. And they did a very presumptuous thing that nobody else had thought to do before. I think it's as simple as that. The idea that you're going to go into a country, and as I say, this is sort of the beginning of the gunboat diplomacy. Later on, the British did very much the same thing in the later 1800s during the First and Second Opium Wars, where they, using their military ability, their gunships, forced China through 2 wars to import opium. When the Emperor of China was absolutely insistent that this was destroying their country. In fact, at one point they said that 90% of the young men along the eastern coast, which is where all the major cities were addicted to opium. People weren't going to work. People were not, soldiers were not showing up for duty anymore because of the addiction to opium. And so the Chinese outlawed it, started destroying it, and the British sent in their gunships. Now this is in the later 1800s. But I think that the fact that Matthew Perry was successful in 1853 and 1854 is one of the reasons that later on you get other countries doing the same thing. And interestingly, that fact later on influenced Japan, because after defeating the Russians, they looked around before they actually invaded China and they said, you know, we have needs in terms of mineral resources, oil, coal, iron. All the Western powers that have the ability, when they need something and want it, they just take it. They come in with their gunboats or their armies, which are more advanced, and they just take it. You know, the British took Hong Kong after the first Opium War, and various other ports. If any of you all ever been to Qingdao in China, okay, it's a German city. The buildings look German. The primary brewery in China, which is the Qingdao brewery, was built by Germans because after the Boxer Rebellion, which came in 1900, it was right after shortly after the 2 Opium Wars, the 8 nations that came in to quell the Boxer Rebellion in China just took ports, they took cities. And the Germans said, we're going to take Qingdao, that'll be our city now. And they built it with German-looking buildings, and they built a brewery, and it's half of the city now is called Germantown. And so you got the same thing with various other countries. In fact, after the Germans were defeated in the Second World War, there was a big discussion, okay, what other country gets to take these possessions that Germany had in China? And it took them a while to figure out, well, maybe we should give it back to China. Okay? All of that is a product of, really, the first gunboat diplomacy with Matthew Perry. Thank you all very much.